Hello. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the 63rd edition of the Global Markets Encounter. I can already see Jim. Before I go to Jim, let me say that a session is being held in English and with simultaneous translation into French. So please use the button at the bottom of the screen to select the language of your choice, and so that you can hear in English or French. Let me also say that the session is being recorded and is available on the ACA Facebook and YouTube pages. Let me also mention that all the previous editions of this GME are available on Facebook and also on YouTube. You can download all the videos and also record the information that you want. Again, let me take the opportunity to acknowledge those who have made this possible for us: the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, GIZ Move Comcassion, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the USAID. They believe in what we are doing, and they are supporting us to make sure that you get information on the sector. I was informed by someone that, yes, Jim might be known, but it is still good to say that he's an award-winning consultant and a business coach and cashew specialist. And he has over 30 years experience doing this kind of thing in the food ingredient sector. Again, he served as a consultant for many public and private clients, including the World Bank, IFC, UNIDO, ITC, Competitive Cashew Initiative, that is GIZ, Conseil Coton de l'Anacarde, CCA, and then CFA, Pro Cashew, as well as for the African Cashew Alliance, and for which reason he's also here. So now, Jim Fitzpatrick, now that I've also introduced you somewhat, it will be a pleasure for us if you could come in and take over and deliver the session for us. But before you do that, let me also let you know that in the last edition, there was a question that came in very late when we were wrapping up. So I'll just read out the question, and then whenever you want to tackle it, you can do that. You can tackle it now, maybe give the answer before you start, or find the appropriate point where you can tackle it. And the questioner says, "Thank you and congratulations on this informative presentation. I would like to come back to the subject of prices. I understand from the presentation that cashew nut consumption has increased in the USA, Europe, and Asia, as well as in countries such as China. Given that demand is continuing to grow, why are prices falling? What are the real factors that we need to act on to bring up the price of kernel, and by extension, the price of raw cashew nuts?" So Jim Fitzpatrick, the floor is yours, and thank you very much, and let's hear from you.
Thanks, Ernest. How are you this morning?
I'm very fine and very energetic, and looking up to finalize preparations for our conference in Burkina Faso. Everything is flying at full speed, and we are so excited about what is going on the ground there, and ready to receive you all.
Good news, good news. I heard your master training program is going really well too.
Excellent. We have 2 editions running, and only last week we had about 76 participants from 12 countries, including also 2 from Cambodia, to join those from Africa. So it's really exciting, and we are looking also to the possibility either later this year or early next year to hold a session of the master training program in East Africa. It will largely be Tanzania, Mozambique, and maybe Zambia, the 3 countries taking the 3 sessions for another edition.
Sounds good.
Okay. So hey,
hello everyone. You're very welcome. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about our usual areas, and we're going to adopt a slightly new structure. So we're going to start by talking about the market, and we'll focus on the harvest and some of the chat around that. And then in our analysis segment, we look at what I'm calling Vietnam's cashew conundrum. We'll come back to that later. Then we're going to do a country profile, a quick snapshot on Ghana. Last time we did Cote d'Ivoire and we did Cambodia. And every 2 weeks from now on, we're going to profile one or two countries to give ourselves a little bit more context and more understanding of other countries. And we're also going to have a regular section on sustainability. And this week, we're going to focus on sustainable cashews from Africa. I wanted to remind you, as Ernest said earlier, all of those 63 sessions it will be at the end of today, they're all available on YouTube. You can watch the videos, you can download them for later. You can even grab screenshots if you feel so inclined. Everything is there. I think it's on Facebook too. So let's start today's session by looking at the harvest situation, harvest and production update. And we'll start in Asia and we'll start with Cambodia. So I'm hearing now a range of estimates for the crop between 700 and 750,000 tons. And that's well up on last year, about 6%. There have been, let's say, a range of reports. Last year's crop was about 660,000 tons. Prices reflect a larger crop on the one hand. So prices now had drifted down early in the season. We are seeing in the last week or 10 days, prices for higher quality material picking up. So that might be an indicator that perhaps the quality is not as good as expected, but still people are saying that the crop should be as good as, if not larger, than last year. Earlier predictions were for a much larger crop. So to a certain extent, although we're well advanced and well into March, there is still some doubt on the situation in Cambodia. If we look at Vietnam, again, I'm talking now using official Vietnamese government figures for this analysis, and we see estimates now that the hectareage has again fallen. The area planted to cashews has again fallen in Vietnam, not by much, but it has fallen. We're looking at, based on the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development figures, an average yield of about 1.15 tons, which would give a crop in the region of 350 to 360,000 tons, better than last year. Having said that, I'm also hearing figures a bit lower. I'm hearing figures closer to 320,000 tons based on a lower yield. And I'm hearing some discussion that the crop quality might be a little bit lower. We're still seeing conflicting figures from Cambodia and Vietnam. Again, it's just a sign that in this industry, we don't have great reporting on crop production until after the event. India, still early days in India. The initial estimate, again, a Department of Agriculture estimate, 782,000 tons, which is more than most traders would estimate. I think that would make it about the same as last year. The area in India hasn't really increased, a 0.7% increase since 2022, not particularly impressive. So at this moment in time, and it is early, still a good crop forecast in India, pretty much like last year's. Farm gate prices, naturally enough, have started high, but it is early days. And I think we're looking at farm gate prices right now, 10, 12% above last year. I think that will be corrected in due course. Let's have a look in West Africa, where all eyes are focused at this time of year. So in Cote d'Ivoire, what we've seen is after a spike in farm gate prices for about a week, prices have tended to drift back toward the minimum price, 275 CFA, around about $460 a ton. The first crop was late. It appeared to be about average, maybe a little down. The second crop is probably late too, which means it's going to drift into April before we see some volumes on that. There are some people talking about a serious crop problem I don't see that. Prices don't say that. It's very dangerous to start forecasting low crops, higher prices at this stage. It probably is a case that the crop is just late. And don't forget, we have never seen a major crop problem in Côte d'Ivoire. Might see some spike in prices over this week coming as the CCI enters the market to buy for some of the national processors, as they're known. Nigeria, farm gate prices seem to be steady. Some concerns in Nigeria on the weather conditions, and maybe a little bit more justification for those in the case of Nigeria. People are estimating the crop around about what I would think about an average crop, but probably a little bit lower than last year. Situation in Nigeria can be distorted a little bit by what's flowing in from Benin across the border, and we need to keep an eye on that to try and judge the situation. But again, let's say concerns, but no real evidence of a problem yet. Prices don't reflect a problem. The market tells us the crop is coming in as it should, if a little bit late, but the weather is not ideal. Looking in Ghana, we'll come to Ghana in some detail later on. At the moment, first crop's over, second crop again delayed. That always brings concerns. Official estimates remain around 230,000 tons, which would be a good crop. Again, that number is way above most traders' estimates of the Ghanaian crop. Difficult to estimate with all the transit trade that goes through, but production is growing, and more about that later. Benin, this is not a good situation in Benin. Let's be honest about it. Business doesn't like uncertainty. Processors who have invested don't like uncertainty. And we're still looking at a situation where we don't have clear news on regulation, the current export ban, whether it will be extended or become permanent. That gives rise to the border trade. So we're seeing quite strong prices, mainly for cross-border trade. Processors will find it difficult. I think that the government needs to act more quickly and perhaps give a bit of assistance to national processors. There are some crop concerns in Benin. Some people on the ground are saying that the crop may be a bit lower than they had expected. The higher prices don't necessarily indicate a smaller crop. What they tend to indicate is an active border trade. And that trade needs to be regulated, or it needs to be stopped in order to support national processors. But what needs to happen, I think, is something quickly. Moving on, looking at Togo, we see an estimate of 38,000 tons from the local association. Seems a big number to me. Again, as always in countries bordering countries with strict regulation, it's not quite clear what is actually grown in Togo and what might be coming across the border from Benin. Burkina Faso, a good crop expected. Obviously, we've got quite a volatile political situation in the country. Doing business is not easy. Farm gate prices started over the minimum price, but they appear to have been easing. Mixed reports from different areas, really quite an unclear situation right now. Estimates of the crop around about 100,000 tons. I would question that. I think it's a little bit lower than that, but that's the figure that we'll use for now. Guinea-Bissau, very early, of course. Minimum price should be realistic given the quality of the product. It is down from last year. The government has revised the regulations somewhat, a lower base price for the calculation of export tax. There is some talk of changes in border regulation and enforcement. Last year, we saw huge volumes go across the border, generally illegally, mainly into Senegal, although some also into the Gambia, but mainly into Senegal for export through Senegalese ports, primarily Dakar last year. It looks like in Senegal they're setting up for a repeat of that in 2024. the government in Bissau might think differently and may well try to instigate something, but this is a complex situation. We've talked about this before on this event, and what we're seeing is almost, you could describe it as a safety valve for farmers in Guinea-Bissau, that their product can move across the border into Senegal, although that is not in conformity with the regulation. So in general, West Africa, a low carry-in, maybe some stocks in Guinea-Bissau, but not much anywhere else. Late first crops right across the region so far. Lower farm gate prices everywhere, including lower minimum prices, but that's not the primary reason for lower farm gate prices. Plenty of talk about the crops. I don't think there's any real sustainable evidence of a problem right now, but we do need to watch the situation very closely. It could well be that we have a crop a little bit like 2022, where it's drawn out. You get a mixture of good quality and poor quality, where prices don't really improve, but availability is a kind of a staccato fashion. Some weeks are good, other weeks are quiet. Big concern in all countries would be that farmers might get the idea that it's a good idea to hold on to their raw nuts. Even if prices rise, if farmers hold the raw nuts in unsuitable storage conditions, in PP bags, in the open, they're going to lose out on the quality of the nuts. It's really important that that doesn't happen. What would fix that, of course, would be improvements in the infrastructure, but that's a much longer term project. So let's have a look at production in 2024. So we're calling, as usual, we do a low and a high estimate, and there is quite a difference between them at the moment. That's because the crops are a little bit delayed. The high estimate, which we think is less likely now than 3 weeks ago, would be a record crop in West Africa, in the world. The low estimate would be something just above 2022. So based on our calculations, even with a lower crop, there's not really anything that looks like a critical situation emerging. West Africa reflects pretty much the world's situation. It's the key driver of the growth in production. Ivory Coast, we think, looking at what we've seen, that the crop may not reach the 1.22 million tons of last year, but it still should be an excellent crop last year. And Cambodia, probably what we're seeing in Cambodia is slightly worse growing conditions, slightly lower yields, but there are some more hectares coming online. Okay, they're coming online in a much more predictable fashion than in previous years, but they are boosting production slowly. The low estimate shows a reduction of about 6% on last year. The high estimate shows an increase of about 4%. If we look at the overall situation, it's not that different from last year, in so much as that last year we had very high carry-in stocks, surplus carry-in stocks, and we don't have those this year. Quick look at what that means in terms of the calculated supply and demand balance. We're looking at on the optimistic. So this one is a kind of a best estimate of the crop, optimistic estimate, and we're assuming that the growth overall in consumption will be on or about the 5-year average, which is about 3.44%. Now, last year, growth in consumption was 8%. So what we're talking about this year is a return to a more normal pattern after quite strong growth last year, particularly in certain markets. That would mean that we would end up with a carry-out which is about 2 months, which is about normal, maybe even quite tight. So with a strong growth or an average growth in consumption and an optimistic crop outlook, the year still surplus, as was last year, but we're getting to a position where it becomes a little bit more manageable. If we were to look at the pessimistic crop, and you'll notice the crop here is reduced, that would leave basically no carry out at all. So that would, a very pessimistic outlook aligned with strong demand growth, leaves us in a situation where the surplus at the end of the year or the carry out into next year is highly restricted. And that would change the picture greatly. But I'm not going there just yet. What we're saying on overall view on production is so far so good, but the hot weather may have an impact on production as the weeks go on. Right now, the best comment is that it's late and at risk, not that there's any significant problem. In terms of consumption, we think growth is likely to continue this year. We have low prices, we've better economies. Last year was 8% growth, 5-year average is 3.3%. I think that's probably the minimum for this year. We're looking to Europe, China, the Middle East, and India for growth, question mark over the US market. Inventories this year, lower carry-ins. This is what changes the picture from entering 2023 with a big surplus carry-in and therefore an oversupply situation. It's a much less oversupply situation this year because largely those carry-ins have been dealt with, and they've been dealt with by that fast growth in demand last year. So our calculation right now is that by the end of the year, we would have a fairly normal carry out. Based on an average best estimate crop. If the crop were to be much larger than that, which now seems unlikely, that would change. If the crop were to be, for some reason, much smaller, again, that seems unlikely, it would be a slightly different situation. So we think this year we're getting back toward balance. Production remains greater than consumption, and that's likely to be for the next 2 to 3 years. But we're still looking at a more manageable situation from the end of 2024 onwards. So let's have a look at our next section. Let's have a look at some of the market trends, and we'll have a look at some prices, and we'll have a look at some markets. So we'll start with farm gate prices in West Africa, and we're looking at March 2023 farm gate prices. We're looking to compare those to March 2024. So you can see immediately that farm gate prices this year are a little bit lower. There's a number of factors in here, of course. In local currency, the farm gate prices are lower, but there's also changes in exchange rates, which is having an influence on that too. So when we look at that, we see that farm gate prices in Ghana and Benin, for example, are much lower. And that's due to changes in policy. It's due to the crop production or the expectations of the crop production. If we look at farm gate prices in Nigeria, Benin, we see much lower drops away. I tried to bring this to some kind of a average price. So what I've done is I've adjusted everything to basis £48. So for example, I would calculate Cote d'Ivoire at about £47, and so that price goes up to adjusted £48. And what we see looking at that, based on the farm gate prices across the region, you probably would say that Burkina Faso and Nigeria prices probably look a little bit overvalued at this moment. Elsewhere, farm gate prices tend to be workable for local processors and for international export too. So let's have a look at those international prices. And what we're seeing, first of all, is that we're, let's say, following the initial, I call it the dance at the start of the season, where everyone quotes high prices and we try to find real values. that's happened. So theoretically, prices have come down, but there wouldn't have been much trade at these higher prices. So we're finding a level now, and that level is, at the lower end of last year's range. So international prices are lower now than they were last year. We have a look at that across the range again, across West Africa. These are offered prices as of March 21st, the end of last week. And what we're seeing is that offered prices are hovering around about the $1,000, $10.20, $10.30. Most of the early season testing is over. If we look at those prices again, adjusted to £48, you would see that possibly there is still some room for slightly lower prices on raw cashew nuts, but we appear to have reached a level. Now, I notice in reports from Vietnam, from Vinacas in particular, that there are some lower offers being reported. Many offers being reported below $1,000 a ton. I haven't seen those offers. There may have been trade around $1,000 a ton. I haven't seen some of these prices. And I think there is an element of there's an element of propaganda from both sides in this. We see Vietnam naturally as a buyer trying to talk down prices. And we see the local exporters trying to talk prices a little bit firmer. That's natural in markets. But I think we are beginning to get towards some kind of equilibrium. Let's have a look at some of the cashew kernels prices. And I think this is really interesting because it is telling the story of how the market is evolving. And so what we've got here is we've got W320 prices, FOB, and these are trades that I've heard. And what we've seen is in Vietnam, from a low price around about $2.35 to a high price around about $2.60, which is quite a big gap, compared to West African prices, which generally are starting at the high end of Vietnam's prices. And I have heard prices up as high as $2.80 FOB for West African W320's FOB. Overall trend is that the kernels market is steady to strengthening. There are inquiries, there is steady forward buying. And I think the key factors here, particularly the factors influencing these premiums that we're seeing in West Africa, would be lower inventories, good demand, and differences in freight costs. So what we're seeing is at the moment is a higher price being paid for better quality, for traceability, and I think there is greater confidence building in the certifications available. We're going to come back to why this happens, but I think we are seeing prices steady a little bit. And our questioner that Ernest mentioned earlier talked about demand and prices, and what we're seeing now is we're seeing response from buyers to lower prices. We've seen that last year in some countries. We're seeing it now right across the market, and this is having an impact on the relationship between kernels and raw cashew nut prices. We have a look then at the average cost. So what we're looking at here is the average cost per pound of kernels based on current either farm gate or international RCN prices. So you can see for an Ivorian premium processor, a typical Benin processor, Vietnam based on imported £48, and then we see market prices, the low end adjusted then for the grade mix. So I have a formula that I take the 320 price and I adjust it to give an average price. So this covers everything from the smallest pieces all the way up to the WW180s. And then we have the high end price, FOB. So this is the high end of the Vietnamese prices. and that again adjusted. And what that tends to indicate is that when we look at imported £48 into Vietnam, so we're talking here about African raw kernels, raw nuts imported at the current market price to Vietnam and processed, it gives a cost price below the average realization. Now that's not enough below to turn a good profit. This is very, very thin gross margin, but it is moving in the right direction. On the other hand, if we look at the lower end of the price range, so I took 240 for the purpose of this calculation, although some people have traded lower than that. Lower end processors, they're still in a loss-making situation. So whereas high-end processors realizing high prices in Vietnam might now be starting to return into profitable processing, the lower-end processor with lower prices, these are the people offering at 235, 240 for 320s, they're still in the red when it comes to margins. What's also interesting is to look at the situation for West African processors, and I've just taken the two examples, a premium processor in Cote d'Ivoire, based on locally sourced raw nuts. I mentioned the price CFAT 275 at the farm gate. Based on the average high-end realization, they're now starting to operate profitably. So some of the problems for some of the processors are gone. Unfortunately, for processors in Benin, given costs and given local pricing of raw cashew nuts, they're still in a situation where it doesn't look good in terms of gross margins this year. Now that's based on average cost of processing. Some may have lower than average basis cost of processing. Some of course may have higher. But right now what we're seeing is still not a particularly healthy situation in high cost processing countries, but it is beginning to come into line. What does look clear is that origin-based processing is starting now again to make money, which we haven't seen for some time. So on this subject, we're going to have a look at the situation in Vietnam. So people often ask, how is the Vietnamese cashew industry surviving in this situation? And we're also seeing a situation where a lot of questions are being asked in Vietnam. So let's have a look at what I call Vietnam's cashew conundrum. A conundrum, by the way, is a confusing and difficult problem, just for our interpreters, in case that word doesn't translate very well. So we're talking about a confusing and difficult problem. So first of all, let's look at the outstanding success of the Vietnamese cashew sector. We talk about Vietnam a lot because Vietnam dominates the market. Vietnam supplies 64% of the world consumption. Virtually everything outside that is either India or the raw nuts supplied by Brazil, African processors, and some Indonesian processors. So a huge influence on the world market and huge market shares. And that success is built on a number of factors as I see it. Firstly, it's built on a low processing costs, and low processing costs are built on good management and on technology. It's built on pricing, competitive pricing, quite low pricing, and to a large extent that has been built on the ability to mix and match quality. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that Vietnamese processors have been able to develop different quality for different markets. So for example, they can keep customers in the US happy with a lower price and a lower quality cashew kernel, and also keep customers in the Middle East happy with a much higher quality product. Similarly in China, a whole range of different products ranging from the very high quality to the very low quality. So this idea, mix and match quality as I call it, is a clever market management strategy to meet customers' needs. So you provide a lower quality at a lower price, or a higher quality at a higher price. It might sound brilliant. It has worked incredibly successfully, but it's problematic. There are other factors in the outstanding success of Vietnam. Firstly, the virtual exit of India from the export market. So India's market share in exports has reduced year on year for many years now. India concentrates on processing for its domestic market. Secondly, slow processing development in African countries. Okay, that's now changing, and that's going to be an important factor influencing the future of the industry generally, but particularly of the situation in Vietnam. And the third factor, which I think is really important, is the focus in the North American market. Huge market, 18 to 20% of world demand is in the US and Canada. The priority of price over everything else in that market over the last 10, 15 years particularly has assisted the development of the mix and match quality based on lower prices. So when we look at Vietnam, we're looking at outstanding success, innovative market management, innovation in blending price and quality. And we're also looking at success built on decisions, failure, changing priorities in other countries. But there is a big issue around this. And the big issue is the dependence on imports. So in 2023, Vietnam imported about 90% of the raw cashew nuts that were processed. Over 2.8 million tons of raw cashew nuts. So we're now seeing a situation where the dependence on import has continued to increase. And that is based mainly on African countries, about 76%, but also now on Cambodia since 2020 in some significant volume. Cambodia accounted for about 22% of Vietnam's imports in 2023. Without that spike in Cambodia, prices in the world market would be different. Prices would be higher, there would be a deficit of supply. We may not have seen the fast growth in demand that we saw last year because prices would be higher and sourcing would be far more difficult. So when we look at this, particularly the 76% that comes from Africa, we have to look at that and we think that travels on average, according to some of the sea distance websites, about 16,000 kilometers every ton. There's a lack of control of the supply chain, of course, because it's far away. And there's a certain lack of influence in that supply chain, as we've seen by government policies in West Africa in recent years, increasing costs for Vietnamese processors through export taxation, minimum farm gate pricing. So the increasing import dependence is a big issue. Let's have a look at some of the other factors. So secondly, we look at increasing costs. And here we're talking about, just look at the big picture. So here we have annual import prices for Vietnam in red and for India in blue since 2011, based on customs figures. So what we see is that the price, average annual import price, has only returned to pre-bubble, I call this the big price bubble, levels in 2023. We see that Vietnam's price of import is now on average higher than India, whereas before this probably watershed moment, we will look at it in the future and think of it as that, Vietnam generally was buying lower than India. Freight prices have risen. Freight prices are volatile. Generally speaking, we will see freight prices correct perhaps over the next couple of years as supply of freight starts to increase. But the likelihood is that over the longer term, the cost of freights will rise. And you can see just in this chart, this is a short chart from one of the freight analysts, we can see the volatility. Volatility is bad for business. It makes everything more difficult. And if we try to add in, so what I've added in here is the FOB price of 320s, just to look at this gap, the gap between the general RCN cost and 320s before the bubble, in this period of very fast growth in the market, and the situation now. And although that's not, mathematically exactly correct, it gives us a very strong indication of how this situation, where margins for processors have tightened, how that's come about. So we're looking at key factors. Volatility of freight, higher freight in recent years. We're looking at more and more competition as demand in India grows. And it's difficult to compete with India because market prices for kernels in India are higher, the market is protected, and demand is growing quickly. As Indian processors get more competitive, as they apply technology themselves, that situation is likely to increase. And we've also seen that India's area planted to cashews hasn't been growing quickly, so we shouldn't expect fast growth in production in India for the foreseeable future. So we're looking at a situation where competition actually intensifies for raw cashew nuts. We're also looking at governments in African countries introducing and increasing export taxes and the introduction of minimum farm gate prices over the last 10 years. All of those factors have had a big impact in increasing costs and in tightening margins. At the same time, as we've seen, production has increased. So we're looking at a very difficult situation, increasing costs, no advantage from increasing production, and this is the reason why RCN prices make a much poorer match with kernels prices in recent years. Add to that distant markets, so supplying from Vietnam to the Middle East or to Europe or to North America is key. But those are very distant markets. So higher costs, freight costs particularly, influence that too. Higher costs of bringing the raw cashew nuts to the processing areas and then higher costs of bringing the kernels back have a huge influence. Add to that changing buyer needs. I've just put a sustainability symbol in there to signify that. So buyers look much more now at the story behind their products. They're looking for traceability. They're looking for sustainable cashew kernels. And this is also causing problems in Vietnam in terms of the thinking and the organization of the sector. So let's have a look at these 4 pillars of the success of Vietnam: the low processing cost, the use of technology, competitiveness on price, and the ability to mix and match quality, cater products for particular markets. And some of these factors are being undermined. So the low processing cost, although processing costs are incredibly low in Vietnam, they're being undermined by the rising supply chain costs and by the fall in the quality of raw cashew nuts. So although your processing cost can be very low, if you're paying more to bring that product to your processing plant, and if it's a lower quality, therefore with a lower outturn, therefore with a higher breakage, when it gets there, that undermines your competitiveness. We look at the technology. Vietnam is by far the leader in technology, but that technology is also available to competitors, as we've seen. Is there another big breakthrough? Maybe. Is there a fully automated plant in the offing? Possibly. Would be a huge investment, of course. It would need another big breakthrough in technology to re-establish that advantage. Meantime, Indian technology, to a lesser extent, Chinese technology in cashew processing is developing. We look at the mix and match and the price factors together. So what we've seen is, until now, demand has responded to lower prices. We saw that last year. But kernels prices haven't really, I mean, even with the recent steady kernels prices, we couldn't really call that a response to these low prices. We're looking at, well, up to 2 weeks ago, we're looking at 14-year lows on cashew kernels prices. We haven't seen the response until the second half of last year, perhaps, in demand that you would have expected. If you think about the mix and match quality, which has been really successful strategy, you got to ask the question, how low you can go. I mean, you can't keep diluting quality and expect prices to rise. If at the same time, better quality, nearer to the markets is developing, as it is in West Africa, if that becomes increasingly available, this can undermine this strategy. And here we have the conundrum. So if we take the example, so Vietnamese buyers, or Vietnamese processors, excuse me, have managed to successfully dominate the US market, for example. They have been able to reduce price and match quality accordingly. How do they now convince American buyers to pay more for a higher quality product? It's very, very difficult to see that happening. And this is where you're going to get, I think, a conflict, particularly in the US market. And I think it's one of the reasons why African cashew kernels have made less progress in the US market than in the European market. And I think it's secondly a reason why US demand has responded, of all markets, the most slowly to lower prices. US demand is very slightly up last year compared to Europe, with strong growth in imports. So what we've got is we're looking at a situation where the original foundations of the success of Vietnam are being undermined by market conditions and market developments. Now, how might Vietnamese processors and the sector in general respond to that? I think there's a number of ways. Firstly, they can respond with low cashew prices to build demand and squeeze competitors. Well, actually, they've already done that. That's really what's been happening over the last 3 years. Secondly, developed two-tiered kernels prices, which can help to keep RCN prices low. Both short-term strategies. And thirdly, add more value. And that too is happening. And there's a lot of talk about that. And I picture products which are packed in Vietnam for a US retailer. So if we look at these possible responses, lower kernels prices works. But if you saw our webinar last November, I think it was the 29th of November, you can look it up on YouTube if you'd like. The idea of lower kernel prices to build demand and squeeze competitors, it works if you can have a vibrant forward market with forward market premiums. So you can sell forward, pressure the RCN market based on lower priced early shipment, prompt shipment kernels and keep those two in line. It works. It gets interrupted by the growth of processing in competing countries. The two-tiered kernels market. So we've seen this big gap between the lowest price and the highest price of 320s, for example. That too has worked quite well for a period. But it could frustrate the value-added strategy, because if you're looking to add value, if you're looking to offer a quality product, you need to have a reputation for quality. This is going to ask questions around about food safety and ask questions around about quality. Secondly, the two-tiered kernels market doesn't at all manage the competition for RCN from India. because the Indian kernels market is something unto itself, trading at much higher prices. So the third option is, of course, the most constructive. The third option is to add more value. Now that means potentially lower volume. Make more money on lower volume would be the option. It means challenges of food safety, getting factories into a position where they can build the confidence of retailers and buyers at destination for consumer packed products like the ones you see in the picture. But it doesn't solve issues of traceability or sustainability, because we're still looking at moving up to 3 million tons of raw cashew nuts halfway around the world every year. So what we've seen happening is that a trading strategy based on selling forward and then filling in with RCN based on a spot or prompt market, which is lower, that's frustrated by minimum pricing at origin, rising prices, and of course, if the market turns and we get rising prices in a situation, therefore, that your forward sales are sold below the current market price, the whole strategy would collapse. So now we're at a situation where kernels prices are low. There's no more opportunity to undercut the price without continuing to lose money. Demand is responding to lower prices, and now you get the difficult decisions for Vietnam as an industry and for the Vietnamese processors. And I think they're aware of it. And this is just an example of a report from a publication in Vietnam which reports a discussion on how these factors are playing out. And I've put a link in there, so when this is eventually circulated, you can have a look at that article yourself. So there is an awareness in Vietnam of this situation. I think that we should recognize Vietnam is a highly successful cashew processing country. It's highly adaptable. There will be a coherent response. There's no doubt. Vietnam will not lose its cashew industry, but it may change it. And how that response evolves is going to have a huge influence on what happens elsewhere, particularly in West Africa. So if Vietnam, for example, goes for high value addition strategy with less volume, then there needs to be processing elsewhere. And at the moment, that would appear to be West Africa. So look at the situation carefully, listen to what's happening in Vietnam. Very interesting situation evolving. So moving on quickly, let's have a look at some of the news stories that were around in the cashew business over the last couple of weeks. I highlight 3 food safety issues: salmonella in one case from the United States, a mislabeling issue elsewhere in the United States, and also a certification issue from Saudi Arabia. I highlight these not because they're huge or influential events in the market, but I highlight them because I wanted to point out just how important food safety certification is when we talk about the cashew business, and particularly when we talk about value-added cashews. These factors in the United States may well damage demand in the short term. And usually what happens in these cases is that it doesn't just damage demand for the retailers in question or their suppliers, Trader Joe's in one case, Walmart in another. It tends to damage demand right across the sector. So that's something that may well slow the response to the lower prices in the US again this year. Another story which I thought was quite interesting is this one from Vietnam, where the authorities are now beginning to look at certification, and they're beginning to look at what's described in this article as self-styled organic certification. And the impact of incorrect, improper, perhaps fraudulent in some occasions, certification in particular segments, particularly organic. And Vietnamese authorities have said that they're going to fix this situation, and let's hope they do so. That would explain some of the conflict in the organic market we sometimes see, where there's a huge price differential between certain suppliers and others. By the way, I'm not suggesting that all suppliers in Vietnam are part of this. They're not. Many suppliers are properly certified, but there are some that are not. If we look at other stories, some good news stories from West Africa, a new factory established in Ghana, said to be 12,000 tons capacity, and a new factory estimated at 10,000 tons capacity in the Republic of Guinea. It just goes to show that there are continuing developments. So let's look back on our market key points. Crops, so far actually so good, but potential weather problems needs to be watched closely. Demand is steady, it's been picking up. Inventories of kernels, much more like normal now. Inventories of RCN, probably we can say the same thing. The calculation, raw cashew nuts compared to kernels, well, margins are appearing in some areas. It's not quite resolved yet. Kernels prices are probably still a little bit too low. Maybe RCN prices are still a little bit too high too, but it is moving in the right direction. Discounted sellers or sellers that have high costs in processing remain in a difficult position, and that's not going to change in the short term. Outlook, from my point of view, I think the kernels price remains steady. I think demand remains good. We may see an improvement in kernels prices as the year goes on. RCN prices, well, I think that they might slip in the international market, drop off a little in the coming weeks if there are no crop issues proven. Now, you know, obviously if there was a big issue with the crops anywhere, particularly big producers, Cambodia, Cote d'Ivoire, India, if there were big problems in any of those countries, all bets are off and we're looking at an entirely different situation. But right now I'm thinking we're not probably looking at that. We're looking at late, maybe a little bit smaller than hoped for, but a crop that probably is adequate to meet demand this year. But let's watch it closely. We leave the market for now and we'll look at our country profile for this week. I'm going to look at Ghana. I was lucky enough to be in Ghana a few weeks ago, get a good understanding for what's going on and the interesting changes in the sector there. First of all, you can see location of Ghana right in the center of West Africa. Somehow you could say Ghana is the crossroads in the cashew sector in West Africa. Ghana is a country of about 34 million people. The area, about 239,000 square kilometers. So if you're in Europe, that's around about the same size as the UK. If you're in Southeast Asia, you might look at that it's about the same size as Laos. And if you're in the US, Ghana is about the same size as the state of Michigan. It's the World Bank ease of doing business is a good way to look at how to transact cashew business in the country. So if we look at Ghana, it's 13th in sub-Saharan Africa, having slipped in recent years. And if we just look at cashew countries, Ghana is about 4th in the cashew countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it ranks quite highly. Area planted to cashews in Ghana has been rising. The 10-year growth rate to 2022 is over 12%. You can see that the production the planted area took something of a jump during the high price period 2016, 17 into 18, but it has steadily grown since then. The rate of growth has been slowing a little bit, but I am told that farmers are still planting cashews despite the lower prices that we've seen over the last couple of years. They're still planting cashews on marginal land, and to a certain extent cashews are going back to their original function in West Africa, which was as a defense against the climate. Nowadays, of course, as a defense against climate change. So I think we can continue to consider that there will be an increase in the planted area. What does that mean for production? So we can see that production in Ghana, and I'm taking the official estimates here rather than any traders' estimates. But if we look at these, this would place Ghana as the 8th largest producer in the world and the 5th in Africa. We're looking at fast production growth over the last 10 years, about 15% per annum. Those trees that were planted are beginning to come to maturity now. So we're seeing increasing production. And the forecast is for about 300,000 tons by 2030. Today's production is estimated by the Ministry of Agriculture at 230,000 tons for 2024. Now we should remember that it's a really difficult country to understand in cashew terms because we have huge flows of cashews through the country. So therefore you get a wide range of production estimates. Some traders put the figure as low as 160,000 tons. The official figure, as I've mentioned, 230,000 tons. What we do see is that production has doubled on these figures since 2019. So there's no disputing the positive upward trend in production. Ghana is known for good quality cashew nuts. So I look at two things. I look at the outturn and the cutting test comparison. And Ghana scores very well in the West African context. And we look at the size of the nuts, and we, in both cases, look at a range, the low end and the high end. And in both cases, we find that Ghana, compared to its neighbors, compared to West Africa in general, scores high. In fact, it's in the top 4 in West Africa for both outturn and nut count. So this explains part of the reason why Ghanaian RCN is so sought after, particularly in the early parts of the year. Now, what really makes Ghana different to any other country in West Africa is the transit trade. And this trade is growing. So you can see in this map, the black arrows represent trade which is generally legal and which is generally from landlocked countries to ports at the coast. But there are also red arrows, and the red arrows would be illegal trade from Cote d'Ivoire into Ghana, and you can see, for example, Guinea-Bissau also into Senegal. This transit trade is growing. It is difficult to record, and it is quite poorly recorded at this stage, and it has had an impact on the reputation of Ghanaian cashews from time to time, particularly in Vietnam, where it's often been pointed that the quality of Ghanaian cashews has been falling, but that is not clear because it may be that those are actually nuts that came through in transit, but were shipped and imported at the other end as being of Ghanaian origin. If we look at the extent of this, and what I did was I took the recorded imports in India and Vietnam and compared it to the actual production in Ghana. And what you see that a lot of material is landing in Vietnam and India as origin of Ghana, based on the port it was shipped from, far higher than the production. So you can see how this situation arises in terms of the danger to the reputation of Ghanaian grown RCN and the impact. Now that creates a huge opportunity, of course. There's great trading opportunities. The ports, the trucking companies, managers, warehouses benefit by that. And it also potentially creates an additional supply source for processors in Ghana. But it also causes a certain amount of distortion, particularly in the reputation of the country for quality, particularly in the recording of origin at destination. And there are probably instances in there too where buyers become frustrated because they expect to receive material of one quality, but they receive a different quality, and that leads to a lot of disputes and discussions and allowances, as anyone in the RCN trade has experienced. So it is I think reasonable to say also that some of the practices in this transit trade mitigate against the development of processing in the country. It is very difficult to build your supply chain in such a fluid situation. And we are seeing regulatory measures that will change that and will improve that. I'll come to those in a few minutes. Before we do that, let's have a quick look at processing in Ghana. Ghana's not made the kind of progress that its neighbors have in processing. You can see the installed capacity, on paper at least, has remained relatively static, and the utilization of that capacity, although it is improving, it has improved in 2023, it will improve again in 2024. This has also remained relatively low. Uzibras is the only real modern major processor in the country. There is this new factory that's mentioned. Hopefully we'll get some more information on that in the weeks to come. Meantime, the mid-range and the smaller processors, they do operate, but it's a real struggle. And that there are interesting features. I visited a factory that was making a really nice consumer product for the domestic market, very nicely packed, lovely quality product. And so there are some positive signs in amongst this difficult situation. But Ghanaian processing has not made the progress expected. If you had looked at this 10 years ago, you would have said, okay, Ghana is the place to go to build processing in West Africa. Clearly that's changed. Cote d'Ivoire has dominated the development of processing. So despite a better quality, despite increasing production, despite the large volume throughput in the transit trade, despite better ports, processing has just not taken off yet in Ghana, but that may change. There is a new sector policy under the Tree Crops Development Authority that will support processing, and there is the World Bank sponsored cooperation with the government and agencies of Ghana, the Tree Crops Development Project, and that is going to make some big changes in the cashew sector. Just to give you a flavor of what is happening and what may happen, the Tree Crops Development Authority is supporting, with other agencies in the country, the development of production and improvement of quality. Actors in the trade, particularly raw cashew nut traders, are being licensed. There is now support developing for processing, support for quality standards. Minimum pricing has been introduced, but it is functioning more as a minimum price. It's not seeking to drag prices higher. It's functioning as a floor price, and there is a mechanism to establish that in place. There is a plan to improve the level of market information, the records, to improve the regulation of the raw cashew nut trade. And although it's not official, I'm wondering if there may be a chance that an export tax on raw cashew nuts could be introduced in Ghana next year or the year after. To me, it certainly would seem to make some sense. We will see. So key points for Ghana. Firstly, production is increasing and it's going to continue to increase. Secondly, regulation. The new agency, the new authority, the Tree Crops Development Authority, and the projects it's entered into are changing the sector, and changing the sector for the better, in my opinion. We should expect processing to increase in the country in the coming years. So quite a positive outlook, but that's not to say that some of the problems facing the management of the sector, particularly the fact that so much raw cashew nuts flows through the country, it's not grown there. There are some challenging issues to be resolved in the coming years. But generally, it's looking really positive for the future of the Ghanaian cashew sector. Our final topic today is to have a look at the idea of sustainable cashews from Africa. This arises from some work done by the African Cashew Alliance, by some questions raised the last time we spoke on this event, and by a general increased interest in sustainability. We've seen, for example, higher prices for cashew kernels from West Africa, that is in part related to the overall sustainability of cashews from the region. So we're going to have a look at some of the factors that make African cashew kernels sustainable, particularly focused on West Africa. So the first area is location, and location gives permanent advantage. Being closer to markets means lower freight cost, it means shorter lead times, it means that buyers need to carry less inventory, obviously reducing their cost. It gives a longer shelf life on the products that are arriving, and of course the kernels are fresher and tend to be better because they're recently processed. This huge factors in terms of permanent advantages simply by location. Now, they don't apply as advantages for all markets. Clearly, these factors do not apply as an advantage if you're supplying the Chinese market, but they certainly would apply if you're supplying the European market or the North American markets. Important permanent advantages which make West African kernels sustainable in the context of those markets. The argument for East African kernels would also be there, but just to a slightly lesser extent due to location. Secondly, let's look at some aspects of the carbon footprint of the cashew business. So if we look at the journey of raw cashew nuts from West Africa, and granted, I'm taking the most extreme case here because we're talking about West Africa. And if we take an outturn of net outturn around about 20% for the purpose of the calculation, 16,350 kilometer journey to Vietnam, processed, and then a journey of about 17,000 kilometers back to markets in Europe. So this case is developed based on Côte d'Ivoire raw cashew nuts processed in Vietnam and consumed in Germany. That adds up to a per ton journey of just under 100,000 kilometers, based on the fact that you have to move 5 tons of raw cashew nuts to get 1 ton of kernels. That means that origin processed African cashew kernels travel 7.5 times shorter a distance than African raw cashew nuts processed in Vietnam and re-exported. Obviously, that reduces the carbon footprint. It reduces the supply chain handling operations, and I'm just talking about counting the number of operations rather than anything more sophisticated. It reduces the actual handling operations by about 70%. There are 70% fewer operations involved in a direct export of a processed kernel, processed at origin. Now, this argument applies for origin processed kernels. So it also applies for Cambodian cashews processed in Cambodia, Vietnamese cashews processed in Vietnam. It's not just about African cashew kernels, but it is most evident in African cashew kernels because about 58% of the world's cashews grow in Africa. Less than 10% of those are processed there. Key factor too is that today, the process anywhere in the world, the process in a West African country compared to the process in Vietnam is pretty much the same process. And that means, of course, that there's no real difference in the carbon footprint of the actual process. It's the same process. So that's the second factor in sustainable African cashews, the carbon footprint. And if we look at the market share, so Europe, about 80% of our kernels are sourced in the less sustainable method, in the higher carbon footprint method, and about 90% of the US cashews are sourced in this way. Third factor is the ability to meet legislative requirements, and I've just picked 2. First of all, we've seen developments in the law in European countries in particular. In Germany with the German Supply Chain Act, and the European Commission of the European Union, the proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, as they call it. Never use simple words when you can use complex ones. But what it means is that only origin processed cashews can meet the full requirements. Doesn't mean only African, it means only origin processed can meet the full requirements. We're talking about tracing the product right back to the farm gate. We're talking about its social impact. We're talking about assessing all of those factors. And that's just not possible in the international trade in raw cashew nuts. Secondly, and this is specific to African kernels, the lower use of pesticides and herbicides by smallholders in Africa reduces the risk of exceeding maximum residue levels. And this particularly, again, is focused on the European market. That's the logo of the European Food Safety Authority. So this is another aspect that it's more sustainable in meeting legislative requirements, which are themselves based on creating sustainable supply chains. And then we come to those supply chains and we talk about traceability, we talk about sustainable supply chains. And I think what we look at in West Africa right now is a sustainable supply chain. It is a smallholder supply chain. That's not going to change. But within that smallholder supply chain, there is an opportunity for huge social impact. There's an opportunity to provide real farm gate traceability and risk mitigation that goes with that traceability. Genuine supply chain certification. And we talked earlier about the focus and that article talking about supply chain certification in Vietnam, for example, in organic. And when we look at this, we can see that the 3 million tons that is traded of RCN loses its identity. And it's a trader-driven chain, and that is not in conformity with trends in traceability and supply chain management as we see them. Finally, the fifth factor is the opportunity for social impact and social justice, recognizing that cashews are grown by subsistence smallholders. They're not grown on large plantations. Often, as in the past, as in 400 years ago when cashew trees were introduced, they were introduced as a defense against encroachment of the desert, of difficulties for other crops caused by the climate. That is a greater issue now than ever. So now we see mixing of cashews with cocoa, for example, as a result of climate change. And this returned to the original role. So there is an opportunity in cashews in African countries to make an impact in terms of the society and in terms of social justice within that society. So the key points on sustainability for me, based on smallholder production, based on the organization of the supply chain, based on the modern processing that now is common in African countries, and based on the permanent advantages of location, particularly related to markets in Europe and North America, we see these factors. We see opportunity for climate change mitigation, a lower carbon footprint, a responsible supply chain, and impact on society and an impact on the level of social justice. All of those things also coincide with requirements of buyers, legal and others, for traceable cashews with shorter lead times, lower risk of exceeding maximum residue levels, and fresh, sustainable, longer shelf life cashews. So the question asked last time we spoke, is it just a case of over promoting Africa using sustainability arguments? I don't think so. I think these are genuine and strong points in terms of the African cashew sector and the sustainable African cashew kernels. So let's have a quick recap on today's main points, the key points that we've talked about today in the different areas. in terms of harvest and production, I'm still saying so far the crop looks okay. Yes, it's late. We should be watching the weather, and there's some concern over very hot weather in some countries. Market trends, kernels are steady. Premiums are widening. Premiums for top quality forward shipment versus prompt lower quality, those are widening. That may be a sign of prices strengthening. Raw cashew nuts, the farm gate is weaker this year. Farm gate prices are weaker this year, and this may still influence international traded prices. In our analysis section, we talked about Vietnam's conundrum, and we basically came to the conclusion that the model that has served Vietnam so well now needs to be realigned with buyers' needs and current market developments, particularly competition from India, the access to technology that has developed, and changing quality requirements of buyers. We looked at Ghana in our country profile section. We talked about increase in production and the potential for increased processing. Watch carefully the regulatory and support developments in Ghana that may well see processing develop relatively quickly in the country. And our final subject on our sustainability section, we talked about sustainable cashews from Africa and concluded looking at the factors. My conclusion is that right now, West African cashews in particular are the most sustainable option for European and US buyers. Some are acting on that, and that's where we're seeing the more buying interest and a developing price premium for some well-qualified suppliers from the region. Those are the main points from today. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand you back to Ernest now, and let's see if there are any questions or points to be raised. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Always with very in-depth information, and the participants are really appreciative from the comments I have here. Actually, the first one is saying that very much appreciated the in-depth look at Ghana. Can we have the same for Cote d'Ivoire and other countries in each edition? I think you looked at Ghana and Vietnam. So it's also the question whether for the subsequent editions, we can also have in-depth look into other countries. So I think that, Jim, is something that can be always arranged.
No, it's already arranged. As I said during the talk, we did Cote d'Ivoire, we did Cambodia last time. This time it's Ghana. Every week we will look at one or two countries and give a profile on them.
Okay. Then there's a question, I take one also on the Zoom. Let me state here that the recording will be taken off shortly. So anybody who wants to ask a question, you can just use the raised hand feature, and then we will allow you to